She
Are we good?
somebody just came in and I muted her.
Oh,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. I see. Okay, so I basically I hit a wall of a very dark night where my practices, my beautiful practices, were not working for me. I could only get so far and no farther. And there has been this intense yearning for the Christ within for, I won't say my whole life because definitely wasn't my whole life, but in the past decade.
Mute my audio.
In the past decade at least, that has been the driving force behind every breath, every thought has been this desire to know the Christ within. And I couldn't. And so I ended up just finally taking this perfect map, which I don't name it in the book, but it's the course, and dropping it to the ground, because it's not the map that was the problem. I couldn't tell which way I was holding it up. I didn't know anything. And I stood still and called for help and admitted that I knew nothing. And in that moment of darkest dark was the immediate seeds of grace, which I did not know until looking back on it. And that book became the most incredible journey that's ongoing, through which I have been experiencing Christed experience as me. So not like permanent permanent Christ embodiment, which is a whole other level of amazingness, but real Christed experiences from which I can then go back and speak, because I can see where I was misunderstanding. And so that is the perspective from which I'm speaking these days. And once again, like for my first book, I didn't know who my audience would be for this, but Course in Miracles teachers keep inviting me, and students keep inviting me to speak to Course people. So that's why I'm here, and I'm here with deepest respect for all of you, and certainly for the Course. But what you will hear from me is not necessarily, the Course is my underlying foundation, but we will hear from me sounds like a different take on the Course, but I'm telling you from my own heart that please listen. Please listen. So we'll get started here, and with the 3 essential keys for knowing the Christ within. But before, I guess I should start off with asking, why? Why would you want to know the Christ self within? Why is that something to aim for? Because, let's face it, most people don't even aspire to this. I guess, we're actually trained not to aspire to it. Like, it's too far beyond us to even dare to want it, so don't go there. But the Christ, and by that I mean the indwelling Christ self, is our own true identity. But, it's true that it is just a seed of potential that's within us, and it's totally dormant. Totally dormant. So getting in touch with it and getting that seed to germinate takes some intentional effort. And as far as I'm concerned, that is what the whole entire spiritual journey is about: learning how to tend and water the seed, and hopefully letting it bloom and letting it transform us from within, letting it reveal to us who and what we really are and what life is actually about. So I am, like I said, I'm personally in that process now. The seed has sprouted, but it has a goodly amount of growing still left to do. But even at this stage, I can tell you that I am so different from how I used to be. my experience of life is so different. The things that scared me no longer do. And I'm hugely more compassionate with myself and also with others. And I know my own worthiness in God and my own safety, like in a really profound way. And I have to say, it's getting stronger all the time. So yeah, getting to know the Christ within is seriously worth aiming for. I recommend it. Besides which, on top of everything else, it's also your birthright. You know, I mean, I know you know that. Every one of us has the right to know our own incredible, limitless, true divine identity. So all of that is why I wholeheartedly encourage you to go for it if it interests you. So, you know, anyway, that's my little opening sales pitch, like why the indwelling Christ self is right for you. So, having said all that, I have a sort of a disclaimer before we go any further. I will be doing my best here to smooth the way forward for you tonight so that you can have an easier time of it than I did, frankly. I don't want anybody to go through it the way I did. But I feel that I should say that when or how any of us receives firsthand knowing of the Christ itself, it's purely a matter of grace. You know, it happens when it's meant to happen. You can't force it. We can't speed up the scheduled moment of transcendence. But we can, however, slow it way down without even meaning to. We can very innocently and totally unknowingly postpone that holy instant indefinitely. And believe me, I know what that's like, to make endless errors of innocent postponement and to not realize it, because, you know, that's where I was at for years. And I know what it's like to feel the frustration of getting nowhere. Why am I getting nowhere, you know? And I really didn't know. But I finally let my errors be corrected on my behalf a few years ago. Like I said, it was about 2.5 or 3 years ago now. And for me, it was a total surrender, because I honestly didn't know what else to do. And it took a while to see the changes, but my goodness, looking back on it now, what an incredible difference. And so, you know, I mean, my my spiritual journey is 33, 34, 35 years long, something like that. And it's only in the last 3 that that all this has occurred. And my evolution has been like into the stratosphere over the past couple of years. And it continues every day like that, which is so brilliant in every possible meaning of the word. So tonight, in this brief time that we have together, that I'm honored to be here with you all, I will be sharing with you just a few of the key things that I've learned through my own direct experiences of Christed awareness. And my purpose in doing this is to help you fine-tune your perceptual understandings, to help you release any errors that you might have been innocently hanging on to, like I was doing, and to help you get into better alignment with the requirements of the Christ self within. Because the bottom line is, proper alignment can help you save a lot of time on your spiritual journey. And also, you know, it makes the whole process so much more enjoyable and rewarding. I wouldn't go so far as to say more fun, but but relatively speaking, more fun. So the attitude that we take is of utmost importance. So before we even get into talking about any of the three keys themselves, I want to talk about the underlying attitude, because it is kind of the foundation of everything. So I'll start out by saying this, because I'm aware of where I am and who I'm addressing here. So I want to affirm for you once again that, yes, I recognize and wholeheartedly know that A Course in Miracles is a brilliant teaching. Its information is perfect and true and beautiful and timeless. But there's always a but. The but has to do with our perception of its teachings, not with the teachings themselves. Like me and my freaking map, it's upside down, backwards, sideways, who knows? I couldn't even have told you what direction, what my problem was. I just knew that the problem was in my perception. So here is a brief description of what the issue is with us humans. The Course is perfect, but it is channeled from a much higher divine frequency level. And that is a level that we humans have no access to. And like all the great spiritual teachings, the Course's wisdom is holographic, which means that the whole, complete, infinite truth is present in every minute particle of it. No matter where in the Course one might look, the complete, infinite truth is there in its totality. But we, we who read and study the Course, we perceive its multidimensional truth through a limited mind, right? We can't help but collapse the Course's infinite wisdom down into these flat, meaningless placeholder ideas. They're pale imitations of the actual living truth, because that's what our lens of perception does. It blocks our access to the higher frequencies where full multidimensional truth lives. So the bottom line here is that we don't actually know any of the things that we think we know about the Course, or anything else really, but especially about the Course. We just have a random collection of placeholder ideas that are kind of like flat playing cards. And they are never the whole truth. They're never the living truth. That's probably a better way to say it. They're never the living truth. So our limited understandings feel really important to us. And they are. They are. They represent a really important, really respect-worthy stage of the spiritual journey. But our understandings lack the infinite depth and the truth and the power and the living juice of the original teaching. No matter who we are, it couldn't be otherwise. So in essence, we misunderstand the teachings, or I guess I should say that our understandings of the teachings are partial at best. So the beginning of my true evolution, like I said, my true stepping into grace, is that I've learned to take everything that I know very lightly, with humility and with beginner's mind, without any fixed opinions about what anything means. Because I understand now that I never really understood anything. Not really. Not in its truest, most limitless depth of truth. So I finally realized that I was limiting myself. I was limiting my own evolution that I was craving so deeply. I was limiting it by hanging on to my own understandings. So with an open mind and a willing heart, I set all my meaningless playing cards aside, and I started to listen within, like really listen, and ask the Christ within for true inner wisdom. And I started asking to be shown what everything truly means, even the stuff that I thought I was certain what it truly meant. And take nothing for granted. What does this truly mean? And that was the beginning of the adventure. So I would say that is the ideal attitude to have. You obviously don't have to set aside your beloved course teachings, not at all. I had to set aside everything I thought I knew because I was so totally confused, and I had to back myself up right into a corner. And I didn't know what the true way forward was. I had no idea what direction to turn. But you definitely do not have to do anything like that. You don't have to set aside teachings that you love and trust. But if you want to know the Christ self within, like I do, you definitely do need to release your own understandings of what you think those teachings mean, and be open to sometimes entirely different and much deeper knowings that may arise, so that eventually you can come to know what it really means to go with empty hands unto your God. I have always been a big admirer of lesson 189. It's my favorite. So all of that is sort of the underlying attitude to have toward pretty much all of life, but it's definitely the attitude to have towards spiritual life. Well, ultimately, all of life is spiritual life, which is another underlying attitude to have. Anyway, onward to the first of the essential keys. Don't throw anything at me. This is one way where I'm grateful for a Zoom meeting. The first key is meeting the ego self in love. And hear me out. I know that the ego is everything that ACIM says it is. And this is all seriously very important information to know when we're dealing with the ego. We need to know what it is and how it operates. It's incredibly important. It's crucially important. But, and having said all that, vengeance or judgment toward the ego is not the way to go. I can promise you, it is not the way to go. And I have a whole bunch of reasons to give you right now of why that is. The first of them is that we are the ego. We are the conscious portion of the ego self. And I know that we all know that intellectually, but we tend to forget. Don't you tend to forget? People do, because it mostly doesn't feel like the ego is us. And that's because of the way the egoic lens works. It separates everything into a million pieces, including our perception of ourself. So the tendency for many course students I know is to blame the ego as if it's a totally separate character who lives inside us someplace. And that is completely understandable, because that is how it feels, isn't it? It feels like here we are minding our own business, being conscious, and then there's that bothersome ego over there someplace, you know, that annoying roommate who steps in and ruins everything. But I can tell you from my own experience of having a moderately healed mind, a mind that's getting comfortable with wholeness, put it that way, it has become very clear that I and the other aspects of my ego are all the same thing. I call it the me-go to remind myself. So to judge or condemn the me-go is to judge and condemn yourself. And honestly, why choose to do that? There is no peace in that. So that's my first point. The next point is you can't give what you don't have. So ACIM's version of forgiveness is a brilliant thing to do. It's a brilliant start on the road to becoming sane. You know, we forgive others first, and that sneaky rebound effect comes back to us, where we're secretly forgiving ourselves at the same time. And that is such genius. It's so perfect because most of us are probably too crazy at first to accept having our minds healed directly, you know, by forgiving the self directly. I know I was way too crazy for that. The ego self objected so strongly to the whole idea of self-forgiveness, actually for quite a long time. So forgiving others and having my own mind be slowly healed as kind of a side effect was perfect for me. It was a godsend, actually. I don't know if I could have done it any other way. But if you want to work with the seed of Christ's potential, like we're talking about here, everything in your entire universe has to be met with non-judgment and forgiveness, because nothing can be held separate from love, not even you. So you drop what you think you know about the ego, yours and everybody else's, and you learn how to meet it in non-judgment and eventually in love. And forgiveness of the self is amazing. It is pure and very direct because there's no middleman. So it's much faster. And having said that, you can certainly add it to your existing forgiveness practices, because those are great. You know, it's not like you have to do it instead. Those two practices will complement each other. But if you try a practice of forgiveness of the self, you will see for yourself what happens. The sanity that is gained from doing this is exponential, and you will feel it. You'll feel the difference. And in turn, that will make your course-derived forgiveness exercises that you do towards others infinitely more powerful. Because here's the thing, like I said at the beginning, you can't give what you don't have. And if there is no forgiveness within, meaning no self-forgiveness, you are not really able to extend true forgiveness to others. You are just doing an exercise. And that is good. Exercises are beautiful and necessary. They're an important way to start the healing of the mind. But when there starts to be genuine forgiveness within, then you can start to offer genuine forgiveness without. And suddenly, that's not an exercise anymore. That's real, true transformation. And it's the stuff of miracles, which incidentally are a regular, natural part of my life now. I am so happy to be able to report. I have actually come to expect miracles. And you can too, when you train yourself to meet the ego self, and by that I mean really all ego selves, with compassion and non-judgment, and ultimately love. So the next point about the ego and why we should love it is unconditional love is, I have observed, it is actually a learned behavior. So I worked pretty hard for a relatively long time, several months at least, to develop a new non-adversarial relationship with all parts of the ego self. And I was doing this because of the next point. I'm kind of jumping ahead, which is you're going nowhere without the ego's consent. That is sad but true, or at least it was true for me, and it's probably true for a great many people. There were aspects of my ego self that were blocking my spiritual progress, like I mentioned in the beginning, in a very big way, and also blocking my happiness and peace. Basically, I was in hell. And for many years, I tried every way I could think of to get rid of all my ego bits, or fix them, or make them smell nice, or whatever. And honestly, they were just not having it. And if there was time, this would be an ideal place to have a little segue and talk about spiritual bypassing and why it doesn't work to ignore the dark and try to climb into the light instead and stay there. It's a totally understandable thing to do. We human beings are pretty much hardwired to run away from discomfort and to seek happiness and light. But I'm telling you, and I know this for a fact, when we try to bypass our suffering, it creates more suffering for us, not less. But that's a big subject and a big teaching. So for right now, I will just say, by trying to escape my egoic suffering and bypass it and leap into the light of God instead, because the light of God is all I've ever wanted here, I was making the ego and its sufferings more real, which is an unavoidable result when we try to leap over our own smelly bits and run home to God instead. We actually make the illusion more real when we try to avoid it. And because I was giving it that power of making it extra real, these ego bits actually did have the power to block my spiritual progress. Now they do not, but at the time they did. So back then, when I had no other choice, basically, I finally realized that in fact I needed their cooperation. So I began a relationship with them, with these pieces of the egoic self. And I chose to offer them my unconditional acceptance and my patience and compassion no matter what. I would never again blame them or abandon them. That was my firm commitment, no matter how disgusting or unacceptable their behavior actually was. So eventually two amazing things happened. And I will preface this by saying that I always keep the divine in charge in every moment, by the way, which, I'll be talking more about that in a few minutes. But anyway, here's what happened. When the other parts of the ego self began to relax and cooperate with me, they also began to cooperate with the higher divine self who is in charge of the process. We'll call it the Holy Spirit here. I don't call it the Holy Spirit normally, but it's all the same thing, the Holy Spirit within. So we had this amazing three-way partnership where we're all on the same page, same-ish page, with mutual respect happening, real mutual respect, even though we all knew perfectly well what the ego self is made out of. There was mutual respect and compassion anyway. And because of that, the pace of healing and transformation really took off. And the second amazing thing that happened as a result of all this, the second thing that I noticed after many months of teaching myself to be steadfastly kind and patient with the ego, no matter what, no matter how it might have been acting up, is that one day I realized that I was training myself to extend unconditional love, because unconditional love is a learned response. It's like building a muscle. It's a choice. It's a moment by moment choice. It's a mind mastery kind of thing, you know? Like, I want to really be annoyed right now. I want to be totally triggered by this ego thing. But instead, I'm going to be infinitely patient and compassionate here, because that's my commitment. So, you know, we grow up and we become the true adult, and we learn, we build that muscle. We learn unconditional love, because until you're a full-on Christ and transfiguration changes everything about who you are and how you operate, at which point unconditional love is your automatic identity. But, you know, until then, you have to train yourself to be that. And you be it 100 times a day, if need be, with your own self. But it works. You start to walk around in the world choosing to be unconditional, which in turn brings you into closer alignment with the Christ self within. And because of that closer alignment, real Christed compassion starts to be able to arise in you as a natural part of who you really are. And honestly, I mean, that's really what we're after here, to get out of the realm of doing exercises, which are necessary, but let's face it, it's hard work, isn't it? It's hard work to work against our lower nature all the time, which is what we're doing when we're doing exercises. But when the Christ starts to arise as a natural part of the self, there's no work involved. True compassion starts to become a beautiful, natural, easy part of your everyday expression as a human being. Plus, it feels really good. Really, really good. Okay. So the next point about the ego, we're still on the ego. Next point about the ego is that the lower egoic self is incredibly loyal and steadfast. I know it's hard to imagine at first, but it's actually true. The lower self is loyal and steadfast from its own perspective. It is trying to keep you safe every way that it knows how. And it has a limited toolkit for doing that. So naturally, from its perspective, it feels betrayed by your desire to get away from it. So it digs in its heels and refuses to cooperate. And it takes a certain amount of satisfaction from your suffering, honestly. Perhaps you've noticed. But like any other living being, illusory or not, it would prefer to be seen and accepted and acknowledged and respected just the way it is, without having to change itself first to be acceptable to you. It would rather have that than to be angry with you all the time, which is just, you know, normal for living beings. We would all prefer to be loved or at least accepted, rather than at loggerheads, you know, trying to justify ourselves. It only digs in its heels because it feels disrespected and misunderstood and unfairly blamed. But it would much rather be appreciated by you or understood. And then it wouldn't create the kinds of issues that it so often does just for revenge, you know? Most of what we think of as day-to-day ego interference actually is not part of its intrinsic job. And I didn't know this for a long time. Most of its hijinks are due to hurt feelings and misunderstandings on both sides, actually. So, you know, don't get me wrong. The ego's job is to block recognition of God. There are no two ways about it. But because we misunderstand and vilify our ego selves, we experience extra difficulties. That's my point here. Extra kinds of sabotage that the lower ego sends our way that really aren't necessary. Love and patience toward all parts of the self brings more willing cooperation. And I can absolutely testify to that. Even though it may sound bizarre, it may sound counterintuitive, this is actually how it works. So here's another point, which is closely related to the previous point. It's the kind thing to do, because the ego is you. So, don't you deserve kindness? Don't you deserve understanding? Or maybe, excuse me, maybe a better question to ask is, don't you want kindness? Wouldn't you like to be understood and feel accepted just the way you are? So if the answer is yes, then refer back to point number one. The ego is you. So, having said everything that I've said so far, when in doubt, I would say to always offer love, not judgment. And that attitude, incidentally, or not incidentally, is perfectly aligned with divine will, no matter the circumstance. Offer love, not judgment. And I promise you, it will take you far into miracle territory. And finally, the last and maybe the most important point, which is also related to the one right before it, the ego self is divine because everything is. Yes, it's illusory. Yes, it's made out of fear. So is every other part of your worldly experience. But God is the truth that underlies everything in existence and non-existence. Everything is made out of God. It's just that some of it wears the mask of illusion, and it's an incredibly good disguise. But even so, to single out anything and keep it separate from God is to actively uphold separation. It actively upholds a lie that says God is absent here. And I can guarantee you, if your goal is to tend and water that tiny little seed of Christ's potential within you, actively upholding separation means it will never, ever bloom, because God is in all. Okay, so all that about our attitude toward the ego, that was the first of the essential keys. So here is the second essential key. Actually, I'm going to take a sip of water before I get into it. The second key, you're going to love this one. I'm really not doing this to torment you, I promise. The second essential key is meeting the body in love. So, okay, I'm aware, well aware of what the Course says about bodies and egos, but the body, you know, I know how big a stretch all of this information can be for students of the Course. So all I can say here is that I'm strongly guided by the oneness that we are to bring you this information. And I offer it to you with greatest love and humility. I'm not just trying to wind you up, even though it may sound like it. And I offer it with my deepest respect for your individual spiritual journey. So What you do with this information is completely up to you, and it's none of my business. And know that I bless you either way. I just figured I should say that first. Anyway, so back to meeting the body in love. We do it even though the body is not real. And we do it even though it is used as an instrument of vengeance by you, by your ego, until it isn't. Yeah, that's where it comes from. But just like the first essential key, we have some important points that we're going to look at about why we should love and respect the body anyway. And here is the first point, and it is incredibly important. Christed awakening only happens through physical embodiment. What does that mean, physical embodiment? It has to do with the limited physical form becoming purified and repurposed, even the Course talks about this, so that it can be the receiver transmitter of extremely high frequency divine love and light. Now, I have experienced myself in limited ways and for limited periods of time as heaven on earth. And I didn't do it. I can't claim that I did it. Each time it happens, it is down to grace, absolutely. But I can tell you from my own experience of heaven as me, that heaven on earth requires the full active participation of your entire mind, body, and energetic field. All of your molecules, all of your atoms, your cells, every strand of your DNA, every single particle of your being wakes up and has its own fully enlightened conscious knowing of the Christ self within. And it knows its own divine identity and the divine identity of all existence. And it radiates that knowing in perfect harmony with God as God, trying to find words for something that's so far beyond words. And incidentally, right there, I'm describing something that is more akin to permanent Christed embodiment than, you know, that's like total transfiguration. That's not what I have experienced. My my physical, mental, and energetic self is not quite ready for that yet. But we're working on it. We are working on it. And anyway, I have experienced enough of the Christ self manifested as me to know the accuracy of what I'm talking about here. And believe me, the body is a definite part of it. In very practical terms, heaven can only be brought to earth by a physical body whose cells can metabolize and eventually become divine light. But that cannot happen if the cells are hanging on to old shadow or old beliefs. Believe me, I know. If the body is denied, for instance, because it's seen as shameful or distasteful, or if it's ignored because it's illusory, it will never be able to undergo the necessary evolutionary processes that allow it to embody as the Christ. Because just like with the ego, we cannot hold the body in separation from the rest of us. Well, we can, but if we do, we will never know our own true divine identity, because separation of anything is still separation. And there is a ton more that I could say about the physical transfiguration of the Christ self and what it requires. But, you know, that would be an entire teaching on its own. But actually, I will be teaching in an upcoming conference in May, as a matter of fact, on this topic. This is this is my topic. I'm always teaching the Christ, basically. That's it. Some aspect of it. And then for the whole month of June, right after that, I'm teaching a 4-week master class that's all about Christed awareness. And 1 whole week of that class is devoted to physical transfiguration. So it gets covered there in quite a bit more detail if you're interested. Both of those events are sponsored by the Teachers of God Foundation, by the way, if you know them. So you can find the info on my website. That's my plug. Anyway, so to sum up, you need the physical body for Christ embodiment, hence the term embodiment. So that was the first point. And here is the second point, which is closely related to the first point, which is that we can't bypass the discomfort that is warehoused in the cells of the body. You know, when we were talking about bypassing and the ego's suffering, the body is where that suffering is stored. Anyway, we can't turn away from the shadowy suffering that's buried deep in the physical structure. It's deep in the cells, deep in the cellular memory. The shadows and the suffering, these are the misperceptions and the outdated beliefs about ourselves and others that are buried there. And it can come from all kinds of sources. You know, it can be from any kind of trauma that was too much to handle at the time. And of course, there are the collective sufferings. I mean, come on, there's the massive guilt that we all share. And because we're all one, we all carry, in essence, the microcosm of the entire guilt of the collective. So that is a big thing too, and it all gets stuffed down into the body where it just stays stuck lifetime after lifetime until they're all met with, well, not all of them. You don't have to meet all of them, but you have to be willing to meet them with your conscious acceptance and by allowing divine love to enter there. But until you're willing to face those stuck places in the body with courage and compassion, your physical cells will be full of this old, uncomfortable stuff. And they cannot hold high frequency divine light if they're full of old, low frequency sludge. And believe me, I know what I'm talking about. I was the queen of old sludge. And no matter how much divine light I would push at myself over the years, all I succeeded in doing was every time it would cause a sort of an electrical overload, like a shorting out of my system, because the divine light had nowhere to land. The cells could not handle it. So the light would race around and around in my body, in my nervous system, looking for an outlet. And this would happen after I went to bed at night. And there would be hours and hours of this until it would eventually burn itself out. It was such a drag. And you can trust me when I tell you it is not comfortable. It's not dangerous, but it's not comfortable. And it took me ages to figure it out, what it was and why it was happening. So it doesn't happen to me anymore. I'm thrilled to report. Because to meet the physical body in love and in compassion and in patience and with respect is a way of forgiving the illusory physical self, really forgiving it. Even though at first glance it seems like we're doing the opposite, it seems like we're making the illusion real by turning towards it. But the forgiven physical self can only happen when all the hidden cellular memory stuff is brought to light and accepted in non-judgment and willingness to accept it. And with the help of the Holy Spirit, we come to recognize that the hidden stuff, that sludge, is actually also made out of God, because everything is. And we recognize that not intellectually, not as an ego idea, but as the knowing of the heart. So now at that point, the body is actually becoming neutral. Now it's becoming less of an obstacle to awakening. And all of this is kind of like a dress rehearsal for Christ at awakening. Because as our unlovable bits are held in love, we feel less desire to hide from the truth of what we are. We're less terrified, we're less afraid of the light of our own true nature. So there's less fear of what we truly are. Maybe we're actually worthy of what we really are. And maybe everybody else is too. So that was the second essential key to the knowing of the Christ within. Basically, to sum that all up so far, the first and second keys are all about the attitude of openness and humility and being non-adversarial in our dealings with ourselves and therefore with others. Because nothing and nobody is an enemy. Everything is God. Even though most of it wears a shitty mask. So if you can learn to treat it like God anyway, you will go far, my child. I promise. Okay, so here's the third essential key, and you'll enjoy this one probably much more than the first two. It is letting the divine self be in charge of the inner journey. The divine self, the Holy Spirit, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't mind the name we give it. But this is a major prerequisite, the most major prerequisite for embarking on keys number 1 and number 2. And, this one I'm sure is easy for course students, putting the Holy Spirit in charge. But I just want to impress upon everyone that it's absolutely vital to do it in every moment, because the ego self really is what the Course says it is. So we need a trustworthy tour guide of divine wisdom, shining its light into the murky shadows. So it is absolutely imperative to always invite the Holy Spirit first, before we get started, to be in charge, before we even think of doing an exercise or a meditation, and to follow where it leads, not where the ego self might be eagerly pointing. And I say that for a reason, which I'll talk about in a minute. Anyway, as you form your careful, slow-built bond of trust with the lower ego self, you will find, paradoxically, an increase in your ability to trust in God. And I was actually surprised when that first started happening. And my theory, because they were connected, it was the same thing. And my theory about that is that because it's the ego mind that blocks God, it automatically limits our relationship that we can have with the divine. But as all parts of the ego self relax a bit into mutual trust, then the ever-present truth of God that's always underneath automatically shines through a little bit more. It kind of shines through the holes in the fabric of the ego, if you like, that are made possibly slightly bigger when the ego relaxes its tension. And of course, as the truth of God is able to be perceived slightly more clearly, that too helps to speed up the journey. And also, with this newly formed divine partnership of higher, lower, and conscious Migo self, the healing of the mind becomes really quite rapid and efficient. The ego starts to feel safe enough to release its secrets, and it really will do its best to help the process according to its own abilities. So that's where I say, always remember what I said at the start of talking about this third key. The ego must never, ever be allowed to be in charge of guiding the proceedings. You might think that's a no-brainer now, but as you get into it, you'll see what I mean. Because if you get too caught up in healing the secrets that it uncovers for you, and they are amazingly interesting secrets, you'll see, that is just another delaying tactic of the ego. It's a very fascinating one, but ultimately it will not lead us any closer to knowing our own true identity. So that is why the Holy Spirit has to be in charge in every moment of the journey. We enter into the field of illusion together, knowingly and consciously, but always doing it with the clear focus on healing all parts of the mind. So you can ultimately be free of illusion. But learning to hand over all control to the Holy Spirit within is an incremental process. It's a process that teaches us total divine trust, which is an essential prerequisite for embodying higher states of being. Because when we truly trust in the divine, like truly trust, we gradually stop being afraid of what we really are in truth. But, you know, like I said, this is a process. None of us truly trusts God, even if maybe we think we do intellectually. Do the cells of your body trust God? No, they do not. I can guarantee you. If they did, you would already be resting as one in God, right, never to return to the illusion of the world. So this is a process of bringing increased trust to all parts of the lower self, especially those deep unconscious parts that can't be reached through logic or intellectual understanding. So that's it. That's your third key. So again, to sum up, be humble, be open to new ways of understanding, see everything as God, including your own illusory self, and don't make a single move without the Holy Spirit in charge. Make these three things a regular part of your life, and if you really put your whole heart into putting them into practice, I guarantee you miracles will pop, the real kind, and your whole life will change. You will change in a good way.